Oein, Melatu, and Eloisa for taking part in this discussion. I will soon introduce our panelists, but first I would like to thank the presence of the new Consul General of Ireland, Mr. Oein Dennis, and Deputy Consul, Ms. Jill Hannaberry. Welcome to UFSC, even if digitally, this first time. The Consulate, as well as the Embassy of Ireland in Brazil, have been great supporters of Irish studies at UFSC and in Brazil in general. So we are really pleased and honored to have this first digital event opened by the Consul General. Please, Oein.
Thank you, Beatrice, and thank you so much for inviting me to open today's roundtable discussion on how the story travels, the contemporary Irish short story. I'm truly excited to be here in the esteemed company of such acclaimed scholars, award-winning, and I've no doubt future award-winning writers, and listen to what promises to be a dynamic and thought-provoking look at the state of the art of the short story in Ireland. If I can just begin with a few words on Beatrice and our colleagues at NEI and UFSC, who time and again demonstrate an unwavering passion for and commitment to Irish studies. Long before Ireland even established an embassy, or indeed a consulate here in Brazil, there has been a vibrant Irish studies programme in place. This is due in large part to the pioneering and lasting contribution to Irish studies in Brazil made by Professor Maria Helena Kopcic, that has been carried forward by her niece Beatrice, her NEI UFSC colleagues, and the many friends of Ireland present in the virtual room this afternoon. I can assure you that the Consulate, together with the Embassy, recognises this and are proud of our strong partnership to date, and we very much look forward to its continued success. In pushing the boundaries of discussion and questioning the norms, NEI continues to explore new ways of understanding and appreciating Irish arts, literature and culture here in Brazil, Latin America and beyond. Today's roundtable, it's no different. Irish author Julian Gough, with several short stories to his name, describes the short story as always popular, that it's what parents tell their children before bed, it's what cavemen told each other around the campfire, it's what all fairy tales are, it's what myths are made out of. I remember well, as a young boy on holidays in Kerry, looking forward to story time. If we were lucky, we would venture to the local village where we heard incredible stories of Irish, and in particular Kerry folklore, myth, history and legend from the village Shanachie. While no Eamon Kelly considered Ireland's greatest Shanachie, it was spellbinding nevertheless. I'm in no doubt that storytelling is in our souls, with the works of Joyce, O'Flaherty, Elizabeth Bowen, O'Connor, Sean O'Fwelon and Mary Lavin leading the way, and inspiring many of today's great short story writers, including Danielle McLaughlin, Sinead Gleeson, Colin Barrett, and of course, our today's guest, Vincent Woods, to tell their stories. In my view, everyone has a story to tell. As Danielle McLaughlin comments, stories are embedded in everything. A shopping list, a series of road signs, emails in our spam folder. It's a matter of interrogating the everyday until it yields them up. With over 4,000 entries for this year's RTÉ Short Story Competition, it would seem to be the case. What is interesting and what is welcome is the move away from the traditional form, with many contemporary short story writers producing less clearly defined forms of what a short story can be, as they explore new concepts and deal with real life issues. In their extraordinary work, both Melatu and Oein do just that. They have taken care with their words, are present and honest while respecting the impact of their stories on those who read them. Encounters of a virtual nature may have been forced upon us all in recent months, but I think we can agree that these encounters are also enriching our lives as we find ourselves able to access the world's living room, where conversations on so many subjects, including those on Irish studies, have never been more alive. Today's roundtable represents another opportunity for us to come together, united by our love of Irish studies. I am confident that you will all enjoy today's discussion, but without taking up any more valuable time, I will hand back to Beatrice to take the discussion forward. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Oein, for the words. And I'm sure we will cover some of the aspects you've just mentioned, as the short storytelling being part of the Irish tradition and Irish life, as well as the new influences and new inputs brought into Irish short story by contemporary writers. So we've planned a roundtable as a circle of questions and answers involving like everybody in this panel. So our first panelist is Vincent Woods, a long-time friend and collaborator of Irish studies in Brazil. Vincent is an award-winning Irish broadcaster and writer for the printed media and the radio. He's from country Leitrim, but now based in Dublin. As it is well known, he hosted a number of arts programs on RTÉ Radio 1 for many years. And what was, as Oein has just mentioned, one of the judges for the RTÉ Short Story Competition this year, which attracted 4,000 submissions, an amazing number of contributions. Vincent has published widely and has taught drama, creative writing, and media studies in Galway, and is currently writing as a full-time occupation. He visited Brazil, as I said, in 2008, when his play A Cry from Heaven, translated as Grito do Céu, was staged as a rehearsed reading. It was translated and directed by Domingos Nunes. He's a member of Aosdána. So I'll introduce the panelists as we move with a circle of questions and answers. So Vincent, it is wonderful to have you back here, even if digitally. I hope you'll come back physically before too long. When I saw your name as one of the judges of the RTÉ Short Story Competition, it occurred to me that this might be an interesting topic for this first round table, for our first digital enterprise. So as I said, this number of submissions is amazing. I would say it's surprising. So what did these stories suggest about the state of the short story or the style of writing of the short story in Ireland today?
It was fascinating, Beatrice, to encounter these stories. And yes, it was the largest submission that has ever been made since the competition was established in 1984. So for 36 years, people have been writing for this competition, which was set up to honor Francis McManus, who was a very well-known writer, a novelist, a biographer, and head of features in RTÉ and the old Radio Oein in Irish National Radio, and a lovely man. 4,000 entries this year. I think partly the reason there were so many entries was that this was the first year it was possible to make a submission online. So I think many people availed of that. But I suspect as well that this very strange period of lockdown actually inspired more people to write and more people then to actually submit a story. In terms of what the stories suggested about the state of the contemporary short story in Ireland, one of the things that was notable for me was a certain sense of anxiety. This is in terms of theme. There was almost a palpable anxiety running through many of the stories, at times almost indefinable, a sense of unease, a sense of something strange, something dark, lingering around the edges of life. Again, I imagine that is linked to COVID-19, to this time. But then after that, the themes were many and varied, and they came from all corners of Ireland. Many came from international submissions, people living outside of Ireland. And in fact, 2 of the 3 prize winners, 1, 2, and 3, were living in Spain. A coincidence. But it was, I did come away wondering what those who submit for the short story competition read, you know, what their inspirations are, who they look to, who they've read, how much they listen to radio. And I'd love to engage in a longer conversation with all of them about that. But there's no doubt as well that both the number of submissions and the quality of submissions speaks to the richness of writing for the short story as a form in Ireland at the moment. And it's a very exciting time. We have a whole generation of wonderful new writers who are already established. People like my fellow judge this year, Danielle McLaughlin, who's I think one of the great short story writers of the world now. And she actually won the Francis McManus RTÉ Short Story Competition a number of years ago. She's also won the Sunday Times Short Story Competition, which I think has the largest prize money for any short story competition in the world at the moment. And notably, that was won by Danielle 2 years ago, and then Kevin Barry in 2012, and by a new writer called Niamh Campbell this year. So for 2 years running, this Sunday Times short story competition, which is open to entries from all over the world, was won by an Irish writer. The submissions to the RTÉ Short Story Competition, it was quite a challenge to make a short list of 10, which were recorded and have been broadcast, and then from that to choose 3 winners. But with Danielle and Madeleine Keane, who is the literary editor for the Sunday Independent, we came to a consensus. And the winning story was inspired by Violet Gibson, who will be remembered as the Irish woman who attempted to assassinate Mussolini, and ended up spending the rest of her life in an asylum in England, where, very famously, the other 2 stories, wonderfully experimental, Kissing Booth, which is into almost slightly into the realm of science fiction, and The Shape of the Strand, which is a very, very clever story, all to do with translation and the power of the word and the challenge of translation, and a wonderfully witty story.
Isn't this interesting that you mentioned that the stories were submitted digitally for the first time? And if I got it well, at least some of the winners were in Spain.
Yes.
So how the story travels, and you also mentioned translation. So how the story travels is the title of our seminar today. So of course, the Irish short story has traveled and has been read widely and been translated to many languages. And but now there is also new impulses, new input coming from out of Ireland into the Irish short story writing in Ireland. So change from this outer world has traveled, but it has also added new influences from the outer world, the inevitability of change, perhaps. So
absolutely.
Could you talk a little bit about that?
And that is a wonderful thing, and it's for me, it's one of the really exciting realities of both contemporary Irish life and then contemporary Irish literature. That the change in the demographics of the island are reflected in the literature that is emerging here. So in the same way that for centuries, Irish people traveled off this small island and brought their words, brought their language, brought their stories to new worlds, to the United States, especially, obviously, to Australia, to the UK, but also right through Europe, and to really to most corners of the world. Missionaries, to an extent, bringing aspects of Irish life into parts of Africa. So now we have something coming back, new impulses coming in. We have new people coming into Ireland. Polish is, if you like, the 3rd language in Ireland now. because so many Polish people live in the country. But more and more people as well have come as asylum seekers, as refugees, have found home here, are making their home here. It's a wonderful change in the society. And so we see and hear people like Melatu Okorie, who is on this panel today, give voice to her experience, bring part of her story here in Ireland, which wasn't always a happy one, it should be said. And she'll talk about that, obviously, the years in direct provision, followed by her time going back to Trinity, doing a master's in creative writing. But Melatu came to a festival that I run in Leitrim, the Iron Mountain Festival, in 2018, and we had a wonderful conversation about the influences, her own influences. We talked about Chinua Achebe, Nigerian writers. And for me, I can hardly describe how delighted I am that these stories, these impulses are coming into Irish literature. You know, we always look, obviously, to James Joyce, in a sense, the master of the short story, who made Dublin a literary capital of the world and immortalized the city, immortalized the country, immortalized the story. You know, his short story, The Dead, is one of the greatest pieces of literature in the world. And it is at once set in a very particular time and place, but is also eternal and universal. And that is, in a way, that is the power of any great piece of literature, is to transcend place. So we have these new voices now in Irish literature. I'm convinced as well that that is going to build, that we will hear and see new voices, not only in English, but as more and more people as well. I mean, one of the very exciting things the last few years has been to see young Black kids, young Black Irish kids speaking fluent Irish. And I'm sure many of them are going to write new poems, new stories, new fictions in Irish as well as English. So, you know, it sometimes almost seems inevitable. I remember a few years ago, as it happened on Bloomsday, being on a train in Dublin, just along the coast by the sea. So following something of the bend that Joyce describes in the beginning of Ulysses. And it was around 8 or 9 at night. And I was suddenly conscious that the carriage was full of voices. Lots and lots of people on their phones, on their devices of one kind or another. And there was a myriad of languages being spoken around me. I could distinguish Cantonese. I think there was French, there was German. There may well have been Brazilian, given the number. It may have been Portuguese, given the number of Brazilian people who are living in Ireland now as well. I think there may well have been Portuguese. And it felt like this wonderful traveling Tower of Babel. And I thought, it's almost as if Joyce anticipated this, as if he foresaw what this island might become, a center, a world center of the word, of the story, of literature, you know. And earlier today, I was looking back at Vivian Mercier's lovely story, collection, anthology, Great Irish Short Stories from 1964. And I was struck by how much Ireland has changed since then. I mean, there are wonderful stories here, but there are just 5 women, which includes 2 in Somerville and Ross. There's a woman called Lynn Doyle, who's largely forgotten now, Lady Gregory, and Mary Lavin. And I think now, if you know, for instance, if we take Sinead Gleason's new anthology, The Art of the Glimpse, 100 Irish Short Stories, that's at least 50-50 female, male, which absolutely reflects the reality of writing in Ireland now. As you know, many of the really terrific, new, powerful voices in Irish literature are female. People like Sally Rooney, like Danielle. There's a whole new line of people emerging. Not to mention the great established figures like Edna O'Brien. Where would we be without her? But looking at Vivian's anthology, one thing I was struck by in his lovely introduction, where he traces the power of the Irish short story back to oral culture, which will probably link into what Oein will talk about later, and the bardic tradition, the power of language, the fact that Ireland was colonized, that we, our ancestors, were forced to abandon one language or almost abandon it for another, how that enriched the English that we took on. But he quoted two lines from Yeats to sum up the essence of a great short story. Character isolated by a deed to engross the present and to dominate memory. And I thought it's a very apt little summary. You know, people often reach for a summary of the short story. What makes a great short story? What is it? And in a way, of course, Sinead's title for that anthology, The Art of the Glimpse, tallies with that. We get a glimpse of something that is truly profound and carries us into a world and carries us beyond a world. And while a novel may open up that world almost in its entirety, a great short story will give us part of that world, like a miniature of it, and enable us to see into the heart and depth of that world, and give us great characters. And coming back to the RTÉ Short Story Competition, that's what the three winning stories did in different ways. It gave us voices that stay, that come alive, that transport us. And again, of course, the power of, we should never forget it, the power of entertainment, the power of the writer, of the short story writer, to bring us joy, to transport us, and especially perhaps in these times, to be reminded of what a few thousand words can do.
Thanks, Vincent, for this wonderful introduction to what the short story was then, what it is now, and what it can be, with these elements from the tradition and from contemporary Ireland, the different languages, the new voices. And certainly Sinead's new anthology will add to the many anthologies that we have in the past, to this art of the glimpse. So I think these new voices now lead us to our second panelist this afternoon, Melatu Okorie. Melatu is Nigerian-born. She's an Irish author, Nigerian-born, and she's a member of the Arts Council in Ireland. She moved to Ireland in 2006 and lived in the direct provision system for a number of years when she began writing her short story collection, This Hostile Life, published in 2018. Okorie has an MPhil in creative writing from Trinity College and is now a PhD candidate in the School of Education, also at TCD. She has a strong interest in the rights of asylum seekers and migrant education in Ireland. And I'll now give the floor or the screen to Eloisa, PhD student at UFSC, who is writing her thesis on immigrant characters in contemporary short stories by Roddy Doyle, Melatu Okorie, and Roisin O'Donnell. So please, Eloisa.
Thank you, Beatrice. Well, first of all, I'd like to thank you, Melatu, for having accepted being part of this roundtable. And I'd like to say that I'm a great admirer of your work, and I'm so delighted that this is happening, that I'm having this conversation with you. Well, I'd like to start by addressing something you said in the author's notes section to This Hostile Life. You said, I came to Ireland from Nigeria 12 years ago. Everything about my life in Nigeria, my upbringing, and why I came to Ireland is all in my stories. I find it easier to talk about myself that way. I'm not a natural sharer. I'm really thankful to God that I found in writing a medium through which I can comfortably talk about myself. So could you talk a little bit about when and how your writing adventure started? And what were your sources of inspiration and your influences in this journey?
Thanks, Eloisa. I like that you called it a journey, because it's really a journey and it's an adventure as well. So just to kind of captures, the whole, my whole writing very well. I say writing as you know, which I put in my author's note in This Was Still Life, the collection of short stories that I started writing when I was in direct provision. And it actually came from a casual comment from a friend, whom I mentioned to that I just have these stories running around in my head and I just didn't know what to do with it. And she said, write them down. And it was such an obvious thing to do that I didn't even think about it. And that's how my whole writing started, And I think that comment that I write, that I find it easy to write about myself is sometimes it's taken literally. Like it's not like my stories are about myself or even about people that I know that closely, but I think every writer drops in something about themselves in their stories somehow. I think, and sometimes it could just be that you're thinking about a character and you think, how would this character react in this situation? So you use yourself as a kind of measuring tool. As in, if I put myself in this situation, how would I react? Would I blink? Would I frown? Would I, and then use yourself that way. So that's you coming into that story as well. So that would be, for me, I think that's what that story, that line means as well. It's not just literally putting myself on the paper. And then when it comes to inspiration and influences, everything in life is an influence for me, or influences me or inspires me to write stories. It could be a casual conversation or that I overhear. It could be a comment that someone makes to me, or it could be something that I observed. I'm thinking, this is great. This will make a good story. So everything works. And I think as more and more as a parent, that the inspiration comes to become something better for your family. So that comes as well, as in it inspires you to better yourself, to do, and then to leave something behind for them. That at some point, your family or your children will pick up something and say, this is the life of my mother. These are the things that she did. So I think there's just so many things that inspires me. And then writing is a journey. It's not just one thing that motivates you. As time goes on, different things come along. Something could motivate, a dialogue could motivate me today. And then tomorrow it could be a conversation that is in the news that would, inspire a different story. So it's just different influences and different motivations.
I think that's precisely what you do. For instance, in Under the Awning, that you mentioned that you put different experiences. You saw people living in that character's narrative, and I also read in a review of This Hostel Life published by The Independent that one of your favorite writers is Roddy Doyle. And that caught my attention because he was one of the first authors to write about multiculturalism in Ireland. And he did that through short fiction. And it is well known that short fiction is Ireland's national genre. Frank O'Connor once highlighted that the short story has the power to give voice to the submerged population groups, to the ones who are wandering at the fringes of society, in his own words. My second question to you is it that perhaps why you chose short fiction as the medium through which you could shed light on the issues of immigration and multiculturalism in the 21st century?
To answer that, I would say that short stories, I didn't choose short story. I think it chose me, for some reason. I don't think it was something that I consciously went after, or it's a medium that I consciously chose. I think in some way it just, it chose me. Like Vincent said earlier, he said that novels are kind of like about a lifespan. And that's just accurate. A novel, you could say that a novel is a life of a man from the beginning to practically the end of a character that you're drawing up. But then a short story is the story of an event in that man's life. So it just captures just a single event that happens in that particular man's life. And it could be a funny event. It could be something about grief. It could be anything, So I think that's the richness of short stories. It gives you a medium in which to capture these little tiny snippets of someone's lives, and altogether. And when you look at the story like every anthology or just like the Art of the Glimpse that Vincent mentioned earlier, you can see these little snapshots of different characters in it, and I find that a great medium of expressing stories. I know with a novel, people tend to remember novels a lot more because of the longer, time you spend drawing out a character. But then there's something about these short stories that just gives you an insight, it places you in a place and it gives you a richness. I read in an anthology, you're getting different voices, different places, you see so many things, and it's all just in one book form. So you can't, I think it's a great way of, like you said, of shedding light on issues of immigration and multiculturalism, because you're reading it and you're finding, it doesn't matter if the writer is an Irish writer, you're finding their own journey, you're finding A's journey, you're looking at B's journey, you're looking at C's journey. So you have all this number of people in one form telling you these different stories, and you can empathize and also find similarities in all these stories, and find out that our lives are it's not as different as we tend to think that it is. It's actually quite similar, because you find yourself in all of these different situations and in different places and in all of the settings that you find in short stories. So so I think that definitely the short story provides a form with which to capture those issues that you mentioned. It's a great form. A novel does that as well. But there's something about the short stories that it gives you, not only does it give you a medium, but it gives you a chance to do so many different things about it and not spend too much time, because some of these topics are quite heavy. So it gives you a way of writing them in a kind of like a nicer format, I would say. So
your comments on the form just reminded me of one quotation by Mary Levin, in which she said that the short story is an arrow in flight, right? And I find it really interesting how rich such a short piece can be, and how intriguing and how mind-blowing sometimes. And well, as regards your stories, I have selected 2 of them from the social life to analyze in my thesis, and I'm working with character analysis since my master's, and I chose these stories because they take place in Ireland. And I must say that I find a way in which you construct your characters as both sensitive and strong simultaneously very compelling. The women in the stories are truly powerful, even without the pain they go through. Considering that you have written from your own perspective as an immigrant woman in Ireland, do you consider yourself a spokesperson for those who were or are in a similar position to yours?
Just one answer to the question: no, not at all. You can't speak for a group. You can't even speak for somebody else. Within it's just not possible. No, I only speak for myself and my feelings. I always make sure that I say this, and I repeat it quite regularly, that I don't speak for any other person that has been in direct provision. I don't speak for, any other woman, immigrant woman. I only speak for myself, and that's just.
Yeah, I understand that it might be a little bit overwhelming, maybe, to think in these terms of being a spokesperson for a group of people, because the way people experience these struggles are not
Absolutely
equal, right? They are different. They are not straightforward. So maybe we could think of it in terms of your fiction representing somehow a macrocosm of a society in which each of these immigrants will live it differently. And that's what you present also in the stories. And In the title story to your collection, you created a language that is used by the central character, a Congolese woman who is living in the direct provision. And this language mixes Nigerian Pidgin English and American slang words. How was the process and challenges of transferring this verbal language to the written form?
First of all, can I just even say, this is the first time I'm having this opportunity to say this. So to use making my character a Congolese person as opposed to a Nigerian character is actually almost is an admiration of the Congos. Like when I was in direct provision, we of course there was just is this community of different nationalities that, you know, it's almost like we have a UN in a small space. That's how, you know, how it is. And they've always been a culture that I admire, you know, because it gave me, being in direct provision, gave me an opportunity to be with other cultures that I've never lived with and to observe them that closely and see how they operate, you know, how they deal with issues and all of that. And for me, the Congolese is one of the, you know, like the cultures of and language and people that I actually admired. So basing my stories on a Congolese character is born out of admiration as opposed to anything else. So I just want to make it clear in case of anything else. But in terms of the language and it's not as easy as people think. It's not just a way of, it's not because you're trying to escape writing in standard English. I think it's actually harder to write in that form of, you know, almost like adulterated English, because you instantly, as you start writing like that, you're drawing up a character and it has to fit perfectly in with the language. Like the character can't say anything that's out of character, you know, or out of that particular expression. So you're always looking, does this sound right? And you have limited people to actually read your work and comment on it, because not everyone can look at the language or the use of language and be able to edit it properly, or, you know, or expand on it or give you ideas. So you're limited with the number of people that you can share your work with and say, okay, could you have a look at this and read it, you know, and read it and make comments and ask me questions about, so I can expand some more on that. And I enjoy writing in that form. I enjoy creating languages to go with the characters I'm writing about. But it doesn't mean that it's a simple process, because there's so many things that you have to, and it has to be consistent as well. The language has to be consistent with the character. You think about much more than when you're writing in standard English. You know, it is much more, what I would say, expansive in the way you think and write, and you go back and, you know, and you start you almost like you work on that language to the extent that you make sure that it sounds right, that it fits the character you're creating. And I don't know how to explain it, but it's to look at that question that you asked me again. How was the process and challenges of transferring this verbal language into the written form? It's challenging. I enjoy it. It's quite challenging, I would say. And but it's something, because it's something I enjoy. I don't find it that much of a hard work, but you spend so much time redrafting it to make sure that it sounds right and that you fit in with it, that it fits in, that it's consistent to the character you're trying to create.
And this strategy you use contrasts with the second story in your collection, in which we have a meta-narrative. And it's a meta-narrative in which a girl shares, through storytelling, her own experience as an outsider in 21st century Republic. And it's a much younger woman, right, if compared to the woman in this hostel life. And we can see that differently from this language that you created, this verbal language that is used in this hostel life, the written language is the medium through which the character found means of coping with the distress she has been through under the Oein. Would you mind talking a little bit more about what's the function of the meta-narrative in this story?
I think it's recently actually in Art of the Glimpse that Vincent mentioned, I noticed, at least I've read, two stories that use the meta-narrative form as well in their writing, or to writers who use that in their writing. And I think for me, for that particular story, Under the Awning, I found it a very useful form to write, because there's some stories that you need to distance yourself from as a writer, because it might be a bit emotional, or it might be a very tempestuous kind of issue or topic, a very topical issue to write about. So you want to write it in a way that it's palatable, to the reader, and in a way that if it's something that takes a lot of emotions from you, I don't know. There's so many reasons that can come into play. For me, it wasn't something that it wasn't a conscious thought to do that. It was more of something that had to happen for me to be able to present that story. Like I've told so many times with that particular story, the writings of the girl, the diary entry of the girl was the first story, the main story that I wrote, which I presented at a writers club or group. And then with the comments that were given, I had to put it in another form to be able to push it out there. With the reaction that I got, I knew that this was not a story that people would be comfortable reading. And so something had to be done, So I think in some cases, like with Under the Awning, it worked out to be a great medium for the girl to be able to communicate her stress and her life to the group or to wherever her readers were. So I think, yes, for some stories it works, and for some stories a meta-narrative form might not work. But I think in this story, yes, it was a good form to, it was a good way to write out, or to make it easier for a reader to read, to balance it out a little bit.
It was indeed, although the readers in the meta-narrative didn't find it that comfortable to hear the story.
They still don't find it comfortable, as you can tell, even from this meeting. But you have to do what you have to do, and that's what it's all about.
Would you like to read an excerpt of one of your stories for us?
Okay. I'm going to read Under the Awning, and just probably a short extract of it. You stood under the awning outside the spa shop, staring straight ahead, barely moving, a pink plastic folder tucked under your arm, waiting for the drizzles to stop. You felt uncomfortable not standing at the bus stop on the edge of the pavement, because you knew that back home, life would not stop over this small rain. The Newspaper Avengers would still blow their whistles in your face, with the Guardian, the News, and the National Enquirer flapping in a transparent plastic bag on their arms. The hawkers will still walk around with trays on their heads, calling out. The blind beggars with plates in one hand and the other tucked into the hands of their small guides will still approach cars in traffic, singing blessings in Pidgin English, Igbo, Hausa, and Yoruba. Back home, rainfall meant other things to you rather than discomfort. It meant that the flat you shared with your mother's sister and her husband and your 3 cousins would not be stuffy. It meant that you wouldn't go to the well to fill the jelly cans in the flat with water. It meant that there would be counselors lined up out along your street selling your favorite fresh roast corn. But here you were desperate not to stand out. So you stood with a young woman pushing a crying toddler in a stroller, and the 2 older women and an old man under the awning of the spa shop, careful not to look directly at anyone, pretending not to be paying attention. You had observed it was the way of things here, so people were not made to feel uncomfortable, even though you could hear the woman with the stroller pleading with her wailing child to stop throwing her toys out of her pram, and the 2 women and the old man talking about the weather. You got on your bus, and after a while it filled up, but the seat next to you remained empty, although there were people standing in the small aisle. You stared out of the window, willing the bus to move faster. A few stops later, you felt someone sit beside you. It was a white-skinned woman, but when her phone rang, she answered in a language that was not English. You got off at your stop, and you immediately searched out the house with the little children, who always shouted Blackie at you, but there was no one at the balcony, so you hurried past with relief. You walked into the house in which you lived with your mother and your two siblings and saw your mother's friend, Auntie Mona, sitting on the sofa in the living room. "Good afternoon, Auntie," you said, and she laughed, ha, 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 before saying you were becoming the only African teenager she knew in the country who still said good afternoon and not hello. Her loud chortle made you remember, and you went quickly to the window facing the small front garden and drew the curtains. You had noticed that the family next door walked around rigidly and spoke to their children in really low tones, as if to say, this is how you should be behaving too. And you had noticed that their children would abandon their games and run inside if they saw that any member of your family was coming outside. Your mother asked why you were late getting home from school, and you said, without looking at her, that you had to wait for the drizzle to stop. She responded with a familiar answer, silence. On the television, a man was talking about how the new American president was his relative. Auntie Mona said to your mother that wasn't it interesting that the same people who were quick to claim this black man from America were the same people who said the black girl from London could not be a Rose of Tralee. At which your mother replied, is that so? To which Auntie Mona then wondered aloud why she was even talking about the black girl from London when the African children born in the same country were not even accepted as Irish and do not hold the same passport as other Irish children. She told your mother how once in her daughter's school, all the children's pictures were put up on the wall with their countries of origin written above it, and how the children with non-national parents had their parents with countries of origin. She said, were it children of any parentage born in Britain, British, or those born in Australia, Australians. You asked her what the children born here were called, and she said migrant children or children of non-nationals, depending on who their parents were. She told your mother that she asked her daughter's teacher to change her daughter's country of origin, but the next day, all the pictures were taken down. It was Auntie Mona who had told you not long after you arrived that the people in the Western world liked Africans the way you enjoyed animals in a zoo. You could visit them, feed them, play with them. They must not be allowed outside their environment. You sat coiled up on the sofa Auntie Mona had been sitting on long after she had gone, and you thought of the day you had received a phone call from your mother that her application for family reunification had been granted, and that you'd be joining her and your siblings. You had imagined everyone would be like the pen pals your school principal had encouraged your class back home to have. People from Canada, Australia, England, and America that you wrote to unfailingly every Sunday about how hot and dry it was during the Harmattan, the leaves so dry that they could cut your fingers quicker and deeper than any knife. And about your French teacher, Mademoiselle Jones, whom you mentioned just because she was the only person you knew who had a foreign name and wore short flowery dresses, which made her look all the more exotic. You also tried to impress them with your taste in music and wrote that you liked Usher, Eminem, Britney Spears, and Beyonce. And you were astonished that some of them did not know who they were because they were not into that sort of music. And you had wondered what other kind of music there was. Thank you.
That's beautiful. I've got goosebumps. Beautiful and touching. Thank you, Melatu, for your time. And
thank you, Louisa.
For having us answered the questions.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you, Melatu. It's wonderful to have this reading, which really brings to life the issues we were talking about. We have a couple of questions coming in, but we're going to leave them to the end so that we now close our last loop in this circle of questions and answers. And Vincent will approach a couple of issues with Oein. Oein DeBhairduin is an Irish writer with a passion for poetry, for folk herbalism, and for preserving the beauty of traveler tales, sayings, retellings, and historic exchanges. He's the manager of an education center and a longtime board member of several community groups. He seeks to pair community activism with cultural celebration, recalling always old tales with fresh modern connections. His first collection of short stories, How the Moon Travels, which actually inspired the title of this panel, has just been published and has been very successful. It is rooted in the oral tradition of the Irish traveler community. And so now the screen, not exactly the floor, is with Vincent and Oein.
Thanks very much, Beatrice. And this is Owen's book, Why the Moon Travels, published by Skein Press. who also published Melatu's book 2 years ago, and an important new imprint in Ireland, dedicated to reflecting the new diversity that we've been talking about and are exploring in part today. Owen's book, again, I think a very important and timely publication. In a sense, it strikes me that it fills a gap that has been almost gaping open for way too long, giving us the stories of Irish travellers in the voice of an Irish traveller, of traveller's own voice, no longer mediated by others, by folklorists or academics or so-called settled people. Owen's book, it strikes me again, in a way, is a gift across time and into the future. Owen, could I begin by asking you where your own interest in stories and storytelling comes from? You know, was there a strong tradition of storytelling in your family, for example?
Oh, there's always been a very strong tradition of not only my own family but people around me. Like even so much so that my mother would say there's travellers haven't gathered until there's a story or a song, and it's so embedded with it actually been in our sense of our identity and how we communicate with each other and how we explain experiences to each other regardless of our age. And I kind of in fact one of the first recorded Shannon keys within the RTÉ structures was an Irish traveller called Jack Sherlock. So it shows that the tradition has been there, and we've been lucky enough in one way to preserve many of the older tales and songs and traditions that had been lost to the wider Ireland for multiple reasons. But I've been incredibly blessed to have people who not only share stories for the want of it, but for the love of it.
And you're obviously a good and dedicated listener.
I try to be, but I'm most certainly, people often refer to me as a writer. I think I'm a scribbler. I think that one of our words in our language, Gammon, word for story is nesco. And nesco is associated with two things. One, it means honey, another one means story. So the idea of nesco is honey, is that one, it doesn't come from one source, it comes from many sources. And a story is always infused with all these other factors and how we see it. And the other part, it sticks to us. Our stories, they stick to us. And I think that no matter how well or how poorly a story is told, it has influenced us, and that story just become a part of us, and it journeys inside of us, even if we don't realize it.
And you say we're all made of stories. You know, we all carry many stories. You describe the stories in the book as folk tales in the introduction. How faithful were you on to the versions you heard? And how much did you adapt the stories to your own style or your own perspective?
I tried to stay as honest to the sense of the stories as I could. Stories will always change, and it's actually a part of the oral tradition of the young travellers that stories are supposed to change. So much so when I came to starting it, I didn't start with scripting it. I started with recording it orally, in order to maintain that kind of flow and that structure and and the honouring of it. And if a story has entered us and it hasn't been changed and hasn't grown within us, we're not honouring it, we're not exploring it. But I did try as much as possible to stay to the core changes, core aspects, core events, and then the stories also, they have the ability to tell themselves. And something that struck me earlier is that you yourself actually mentioned about how a lot of the narrative around short stories in Ireland is about people coming to Ireland or leaving Ireland. And very rarely do you ever explore people who travel within Ireland, which is a very different dynamic. And I think that allowing ourselves the freedom to say this is a version of the story rather than the story, because there's no true absolute version. And if it is, you've killed the story. You've not to put a pun on it, you've settled it. The idea that you've fixed into a place that isn't allowed to grow and shine and develop into itself, to make sure that it brings part of you. And part of you is your biases and your hopes and your dreams and your fears, but they're still honestly a part of you. And within the I suppose, our tradition for travellers, those stories are supposed to pass to us and from us. And they're like, we don't own them, and we can be the tellers of them, but we don't own them. They possess us for a while.
You also write these quite at times personal introductions to individual stories, where you tell us something of the background, the moment you heard the story, who you heard them from. glimpses of life that are often very moving and somehow augment the story that follows. And I wonder again, is that part of the tradition of storytelling within the broader traveller community?
It most certainly is. I think that one of the responsibilities that when we pass a story along, that you always honour where it came from. So you know that it's like there's a line flowing through it. But also a part of when I was kind of developing the piece and working through the stories is that it really came as a very strong realization that like vast majority of people in the country have no idea who travellers are. And people who are interested in travellers still don't know who travellers are from a cultural point of view. They only know us from the weight of our issues. When people talk about travellers, about accommodation crisis, mental health crisis, all these other things, educational barriers, but no one has really gone into travellers as people. And at the moment, like I can count the writers within the community on one hand, and there's 40,000 people. So sometimes it's not only about the stories, or the validity of the stories, or the movement of them. It can often be the platform that people have to share them. And while like 40,000 people, and this book being the first book on folk tales written by a traveller, is phenomenal. Like that just shows you how those platforms where people feel are open aren't as open as they assume. And while we're not short of information and books and paintings and songs about us, we're absolutely starved from those creative aspects from ourselves into the wider world.
Well, I remembered when I was reading your book, I remembered somebody who has been almost something of a lodestar for myself in terms of life and creativity, John Riley, the great traveller singer from Boyle and Roscommon, who gave us wonderful songs like The Well Below the Valley.
Which was a surviving song. When it was first recorded, that song had been missing from the folklore's archives and existing for over 150 years. And when it was first identified, that song, people were suspicious of the folklorists who gathered it and the musicians who gathered it, almost they going, that song couldn't possibly exist. We haven't come across it for 150 years. Now, parts of it had changed and grown and the title had adapted, but it just shows you how integral those stories and songs and how people become custodians of them. And John Riley, his work is just it's phenomenal. And I know every so often people highlight him, but also the fact that he wasn't doing this in isolation. There was so many more people, like the Horans and like Dunas and Felix and I kind of going, once you start peeling back those layers, you realise travellers have always been here. We've always had our stories and our songs, but very rarely do we get the opportunity to share them, which is really interesting because one of the main things and it's very uncomfortable for people within the Irish narratives, is that we talk often about the occupation from England. So we talk about the strangulation of the language and these oppressions. And here I am, I'm in Kerry, but people know as kind of a member of the travel community. And it is illegal to be a nomadic in the country. Places that we have are called halting sites because they're referred to fix us into places, and we have no transient bays to enact our traditional movements. And people become very uncomfortable with that, realizing we talk about the horrors of the English kind of occupation and treatment, when Ireland continues, even now with like the centres and kind of the asylum spheres, that we do fix people to places in ways that do not honour them nor us.
Absolutely. You mentioned earlier, Owen, you mentioned gammon. And one of the joys of your collection is the use of words from gammon, cant, this kind of almost internal language that has been used for centuries, is still used by travellers. And it's almost in a way a code that allows for communication that can exclude the other, which obviously has a great value. But it also has echoes of Old Gaelic. It has echoes of all kinds of things, and that is intriguing. That really adds to the texture and the richness of what you're doing. Tell us a little bit more about gammon and your own experience of it.
Well, gammon itself, I grew up speaking it quite like heavily within the household. Very interestingly, almost 2 years ago, it was accepted onto the UNESCO list of intangible kind of cultural artifacts, which means Ireland has supported through the Department of Heritage to protect it and celebrate it, but also they recognise it as a language. If people were looking for it, there's very little resources under Gammon or Cant. It's usually recorded on the title of Shelta within the world of academia. There's like PhDs all over the place. But when I was recording the stories, I wanted to say it in a natural voice. So I wasn't going to force words in the same way. Like, I very rarely say house. I say Kenya, which is a home, you know. So I wanted that to be reflective because I'm telling the story, you know, and that's part of the story. But also there's parts that travel, and just like the language of how travel sometimes uses it in a protective way to communicate understandings to each other, there was aspects of that there was words that are in the stories that are not in the glossary at the end, and part of that was because there's aspects of those stories, the signal and different understanding of the travelers will get. It's almost like there's two stories coinciding with one another, and unless you get the references from a cultural point of view, you don't get what I'm really saying. So you think I'm talking about, oh, he's talking about this willow tree. I'm not. I'm talking about something entirely different. The travelers will get immediately, and I played with that because the idea of like going, these stories are for everybody, but it's about the traveler tradition. And also, I didn't want to just be limited to the idea of I'm a traveler and I want to write for loads of things, but I happen to be writing about travelers. And that is very curious because very often the only time people want to hear, and it irritates me at times, but hear about travelers is about travelers. And there I am going, I'm writing a book about travelers. You know? And so I think that we should have the freedom to write what we want. You know, and this happens to be what I wanted to write at that moment in time in that process. But yeah, it's a curiosity. But Gammon, I think it's beautiful. It's vibrant, just like Irish. There's nuances and tones. Like even the word like alami, which roughly means like the deep dark of the night. That's found in Oein scripts and carvings of our ancient writers. So our word for priest or holy person means kunya, which means druid. I was very surprised to hear that. So there's parts of our language that coexisted like from ancient times that we don't even realize, and they're flourishing within us. And when I was creating that, especially recording it, I just wanted to honor it, to make sure that I'm not talking to this imaginary audience. I'm talking to the people I'm telling a story to, and no matter who they are, I just wanted to honor the story. Going, this is how I actually would tell it. And
the fragments of ancient memory and experience embedded within words.
Yeah, and there's references and there's connotations and there's a lot of little hints and it's developed over time. And what was really fascinated to me is when the stories first went out is that I was really interested in where, so one of the terms of the wider community, now we say like settled people, we actually, the traditional term is pofair, which means someone off a place. Or so other times we say country people, which just means someone who has a physical place. And the reference to land ownership is very different because traditionally for travelers, the understanding of owning a land is bizarre. You can be custodian, you can mind it, you can grow on it, you can have responsibility for it, you can have animals on it. But the fact that you own it, it's quite unusual. And which I think is really unusual. But sorry, I'm off to lose my train of thought. Can you just repeat?
No, I was just commenting on the fact that in a way, the Gammon seems to hold these deep fragments of ancient experience and meaning. But I'm also, you answered something else for me in what you said, which is initially I thought, oh, I wonder, maybe the glossary isn't complete.
Of course not.
Is that an omission? But actually then I began to enjoy the fact that it wasn't, because it made me work. It made me think, that word isn't in the glossary, so let me work around what I imagine it means.
Yes.
I really liked that challenge.
Yeah, and it invites us in as well, because we're offering spaces, especially with kind of potential education divides, or the linguistic narrative, and I suppose what's used in common tongue can be very specific, can be alienating for travellers. So writing it was really going, this story travellers are going to get primarily. So initially there's nothing in here that's going to be really unusual and kind of othering and odd. But I like that kind of reversion, that the amount of tweets and messages I'm getting kind of going, what's this about? Or why is there two different words for child? It's like, well, one's a child, the one's kind of like, it's complicated, and I don't have to answer that. And I think as well as it being one of the few writers, people who are writing, like obviously the Rosie McDonough, who's amazing, Michael Collins, is that even though I can say, and I know Melatu mentioned earlier, is that oh my God, we don't represent the community. There is an applied pressure that you do, because people don't really know anything else about us. So suddenly our words have this little bit of extra weight. So when you're doing that, you might as well just make it as honest and open and transparent as possible. And going through the stories, the way they want to tell themselves from me, because I know traditionally they're seen as entities, because they're part of other people's lives. They're seen in the enlivenment themselves. Moving those on and sharing them has been a joy. And I've been very blessed that I didn't actually have a moment of this like writer's agony, which I often hear about. The people are beside the keyboard and their brow is wet with sweat and they don't know what to do. I was like, I'll be back in 10 minutes. I'm gonna have myself a cup of tea. And it's like I'm not going to punish myself nor anyone else with this. I'm just going to see where it takes me. And I have to say it was absolutely adorable. Absolutely adorable.
I imagine you don't really want to be landed with the weight of being a kind of literary ambassador for the Irish traveling community, but you're clearly deeply proud of your heritage, and I imagine you'd like young travelers to take inspiration from what you've done, what you do, what you illustrate for the book. Leanne McDonough has done with her drawings, and someone like Rosie McDonough does as well. I mean, it's as if, again, they're a new voice, a new generation emerging, which honor the past, and can show a path to the future for those to come.
I think it's what's really important to me as well, Vincent, is that it's not just travellers. I'm often picking up the last thought I had earlier. So one of the things I was really interested about, so when I was talking about the stories like going where stripes came from and why crows have this hoods and all these other stories, I realised that the majority of the population has lost those stories. Like people remember certain stories like why the Larkin is the king of all kind of the birds, why Robin has very trust, which seems to be very, very strong people. But then everything else seems to be gone. There was this huge tradition of making sense of the world, especially in times of chaos, so that everything became familiar, had a meaning, had an understanding, had this kind of this animism of why we belong and relate to each other. And then within a couple of generations, they've seemed to be lost in the common mind of people. Now the archives are still there and there's some recordings of them, but most people I talk about haven't maintained that connection to their own folklore, which means they've lost parts of their own people. And so I think one thing, it's not just an act of joy, an act of celebration and either entertainment or literary kind of function. It's also a challenge for us to remember people behind us. Because if we don't remember people behind us, they're not coming with us into the future. And I think that we can do far more to honor them and their experiences and their losses and their gains. And just when we pass, we're gone, but when we're forgotten, we're dead. And I think that kind of thing is a big difference. And that's what folk tales and literature can do. They give life to so many people and ideas and worldviews that otherwise will be lost forever.
Would you read something for us, Oein? Sebastian Barry has praised your book, saying your versions of the stories are extraordinary and deeply affecting, and again saying that the whole enterprise, as he puts it, is both personal and universal, and I love that conjunction, and marks the debut, he says, of a true writer.
Yeah, and I won't lie to you, when I read that, I did scream in the kitchen for like half an hour. So I know one shouldn't have these heroes, but I was just like, I felt very welcome into this new world and new space. So the story I've chosen is Why the Moon Travels, seen as the title of the book, and means Anelami Ludus Mishler. And it goes, my father used to stand in the hallway beneath the amber glow of the light, equally stepping between the bedroom of my brother and I shared, and that of my older sister. With a cup of tea in hand and maybe a cigarette, he would recount the old stories and lull us off to a deep sleep. He was gifted those stories around campfires in his youth, from old and young alike, who filled the evenings with tales and ever-growing retellings. For many travellers, the gift of a story comes with a responsibility to retell it, for untold stories pass into the forgotten. One of the reasons we tell stories is that they remind us that travellers are part of the world and the world is part of travellers. When you don't see nor hear yourself anywhere else, stories like this become important to us as an anchor to where and why we live. This is one of the traditional stories my father once told me at bedtime. It is shorter than most, and although bittersweet, it has always made me smile. In a time long ago when the earth was young and the moon was a disk set in the sky, silent and still. Sometimes in whispered rumours it was said the moon would visit. When it did, it would take the form of a beautiful lady. Charming, alluring, stern and strong, she was a light unto herself and was kind to those of the earth. She guided many at night with her light that she had borrowed from the day, making sure that none of them would ever lose their way as they travelled near or far from home. It was told that during her time on earth, she met and fell in love with him in care. He was short of stature, slender and wispy, without a single distinguishing physical feature that would make him stay in the minds of those who had met him. Nevertheless, people's eyes still fell in warmth on him. While he was neither sun nor star, he had a secret glow expressed in the unspoken words and graceful motions. One night, on his way back from town, where he had spent the day sweeping chimneys, he decided to cut through a field to get home more quickly. Although his steps were hurried, he found his sight captured by the moon. He held his lingering gaze and sensing the warmth between them. She descended from the sky, slowly changing from a sphere of light to the glowing outline of a figure. He was terrified and turned to flee, but she started singing a low melody with the words of which he didn't understand, but sensed to be kind and welcoming. He turned back to her and saw her for who she was, not just a moon, but a beautiful woman. She was lovely and fair, with skin like fresh snowflakes and hair like softened milk, light mixed with grey, like clouds passing through the twilight sky. Her eyes were pale blue, soft as falling snow. She was draped in cloths of dark twilight blue with glints and speckles of starlight, and black lipped in soft copper tones. Their love was wild, warm, and daring, and enough to charm even the stars from the heavens. She swore him to secrecy, though, as mortal men were not meant to have love affairs with those of eternity. For many years she visited once a month and met with the Mincair in the silence and wonder of the night. They would meet by a young river, and the sounds of its trickling waters echoed and murmured in their love. Days, months, and years went by, but age chased him slowly, for time is halt in mortal men in the presence of eternity. While those around him succumbed to the battering of time, the Mincair grew older at a very slow pace. He hurried through his days, eager for night to fall. He would choose a camp without the shelter of tall trees and would wait for the night without clouds, longing for a glimpse of his beloved. He would sleep with the canvas of his lobe open, so he would gaze up at the sky or down the moon's reflection in the river. In time, his want of her consumed him and ate much of his joy. The once charismatic Mincair grew boastful and full of pride. One night in a pub surrounded by friends, he told them of a beautiful lady that was the moon, and that she had taken and chosen him for lover and companion. Of course, his friends did not believe him, so he decided he would show them. When next the moon came to the river, the Mincair hid his friends behind a holly bush, allowing them to catch glimpses of her. The moon, though, in her ageless wisdom and always knowing when eyes were upon her, understood that he had lied and had discovered his friends. She was so shocked and bereft at his betrayal that she turned from the lover in his mortal embrace. She went back to the sky and hid herself in the darkness of the great nothing. The heartbroken Mincair called to the sky, but the moon would not answer. She loved him and knew that he, despite the wrong, loved her. But now that their passion was known, they could not be together. Since then, the moon is no longer settled upon the heavens, but creeps out tentatively each night and searches the earth for some to love her as much as she would love them. Each time she is disappointed and sorrowfully returns her face away. She returns to rest in the solace of the great nothing, until the sharpness of her grief is again blunted by the deep well of strength that lies within her, and again she gazes hopefully upon the earth. Since that night, and every night since, the moon herself, she travels the sky.
Lovely, Owen. And you say at the end, among other things, this story reminds me of the fragility of trust and the innate desire to love in all people. And there it is. It's beautiful. I think we might have had a bit of mic sound on it, but the story is wonderful. And as the title story of that fine new collection. Owen, thank you so much.
Thank you very much.
Beatrice, and back to you.
Thank you, Vincent, and thank you, Owen, for this wonderful reading. Sebastian there is so right. Thank you very much. So we now have a couple of questions coming in the chat box, and Eloise is going to direct them to each of you. I just have to remind, before we do this chat Q&A, that those, particularly the students who registered via the postgraduate program website, need to leave their names in the chat box so that then their certificates are issued. Because for the students here, it will count as academic activity, digital. And I also need to thank our two intern students who work in the backstage as trailblazers of the digital world, Harissa and Caroline. Thank you very much. So with you, Eloisa.
Aline has a question to Vincent. In terms of structure, production and broadcasting, how different are radio short stories from radio plays?
I think in general, a short story is rather more straightforward, a short story for radio, in that you would generally have just one narrative voice, whereas a radio play might have a myriad of voices. You might have 5, you might have 10 characters who come to life through the play with different voices. In general, a short story will be written as a narrative for one voice, which may contain others. But the radio play allows more scope for experimentation, for sound effects, for journeying in time, for the creation of a kind of myriad of sound worlds that are probably more difficult to capture in a short story, because even a short story in its essence has to go to the heart of things. And it's what Melatu talked about earlier, you know, and so I think a short story for radio might be marginally different to the short story for the page, for print, in that certainly when I'm reading, as I was for this competition, reading short stories for radio, I'm also listening. I'm listening for the voice that will carry it when it's broadcast. And that voice has to be really strong and true and convincing. Obviously, it has to be on the page too, but in a sense, you take on an extra dimension with a short story for radio. I mean, the two are, the short story and the radio play, of course, are linked, but they are distinct, they are separate.
Thank you. Viviane has a question to Melatu. Who were the writers that inspired you?
I was trying to unmute myself. That's an interesting one. So many writers inspire me, and in different forms. Like I'm always interested in language. You know, let me just bring it down to that. So I find myself, I admire writers that when I read their work, it takes me in instantly to, you know, I have a feel of the culture, of the people, of the place that the story is set in. Let me use, I mentioned Roddy Doyle there. So to use him as an example, when I read his work, I see the character. I know if he's a Dublin man, you know, a Dublin native, the age and everything, I get a feel of that. Even the way he speaks, the character speaks now, you know, you get a taste of that from just that particular short story, or the language that he uses. There's an extract from his from one of his stories. I think it's Star. I'm not sure now. That I used once in a workshop, and there's a line there that Henry is, you know, I think it's something Henry, you know, and there's a line there where they're at the airport, and then the man says he was sitting on a chair that is very dear, you know. And I always ask, if I'm doing a work, I say, what do you think? I show that extract and I say, what is it that you know, when you read this story, tells you that you're reading about someone, you know, Ireland and all of that? And people always get so many things, but it's just that word dear, you know, it's so dear. That's so Irish, because, you know, if it's a Nigerian person, they'll probably say something else. We'll say probably it costs too much, or it took cost or something. But it's so dear. It's only when I moved to Ireland that I started use, you know, I heard that expression used to show, you know, something is expensive, but it's very dear, you know. So it's just these little things that sometimes people miss, but it just does just the language that they use, just the tiny things, phrases here and there that shows you the people, or the way, an authentic feel of a people. That's, you know, that's just what I like. So I like reading Roddy Doyle stories does that. And there's so many writers as well that do that as well. So there's Lisa McNinney, and there's so many like that they're writing that form.
Thank you, Melatu. Janaína is asking Oein, what is your creative process when writing a story? Do you have a specific routine for writing?
I also struggle to unmute, but I'm here. So I think my process can change depending on the environment I am in, but it usually comes to the idea that I muse on it. I have to hear it kind of orally. I repeat it to myself. I usually listen to it on a dictaphone, because I find that when I'm saying the story as I want to say it, it's so very different than when you're reading it, because it comes choppy and becomes very fixed. So what I do is, and then I look at the story and I play with it and make sure that is it there, and also like because a part of the tale is in my mind doesn't necessarily that it means it's on the page or on the paper. And I find that process really interesting, the idea of looking for those gaps of what the story is to myself or how it's developing. But it usually is a listen, muse, dream on it, play with it, let it tell you what it wants to be. Because I often find that I can start out, especially with my own creations, I can start out with the idea going, this is the story I want and this is what's going to happen to it. And then this character is going to do this is going to be the ending. And that's not the story. That's not what the story wanted to be. So the story, that there was a whisper there that I didn't hear the first time around. And then when I'm actually doing the process, that's what comes out. That makes itself known. I'm going, oh, that's the I didn't realize that myself and the story were strangers when we first started talking to each other. But now that we know each other, I know what it's trying to say to me and what I'm trying to say through it. So yeah, and I think the main thing is remain playful with it. And that's what I do. I think that remains a part of my process, that I do not want to suffer in any way with a tale, because we're either passing on a bit of life or we're creating it ourselves. And if possible, that's a joyous act.
Thank you, Oein. Daniela has a question that I think can be answered either by Oein and Vincent, or maybe you can discuss it together. She's asking, how do you perceive identity representations in contemporary Irish literature production, so influenced by multiculturalism, but at the same time inserted in a global context of xenophobic insurgency?
Ooh, it's a big question. Well, in a way, I think Melatu is the person who is at the heart of the answer, multiculturalism has become a reality in Ireland, and that is a wonderful thing. I look out the window where I live here in North Inner City Dublin, and I see the world pass every day. I hear about 10 languages passing in the day, and it lifts my heart. Inevitably, that changing reality is reflected in the literature that is written. So in that sense, the production of literature must reflect reality. And it is deeply heartening that it is doing so. The presence and voice of somebody like Melatu is an immeasurable addition to the world of Irish writing. Owen's presence in a different way reflects changing realities too. Long overdue. But it's part of a turn that is ultimately, I believe, to the good and to the benefit of Irish writing in the world. I don't know if Owen or Melatu would like to add anything to that.
I very quickly, because I'm especially curious Melatu's kind of insight on it. But from my point of view, I think that it's not a new diversity. It's not becoming interculturalism. It's that we're realizing and becoming more mature that Ireland has always been a diverse place. We've obviously people of colour, we have a few different faiths, people of kind of the histories and different origin points, but they've always been and they're a part of Ireland. Ireland belongs to everybody who's here and identifies with us, and and regardless of our histories, like Ireland is Ireland. So it's not new. I've never seen it as new. I think that it's just that we're actually starting to listen a bit more, and the voices are becoming so much so that we're starting to hear them, and be either by population numbers or about access points, but they're there. Not only are they there, there's far more there. And even our censuses for years and our records, Ireland has been incredibly diverse. It's just, however, it was also and continues to be in parts very oppressive and very monocultural. And forgetting, just like our saying, there's 40 shades of green in Ireland. There's millions of people. And that diversity is so much a part of us, but for whatever reason, we seem to follow this is Irish, even though we know it to be untrue. We know it to be untrue. And I'm not sure how you feel about it, Melatu.
Just to add to what Vincent and you, Oein, have just said, it doesn't mean that the fact that, it's the writings are reflecting Irish reality as it is now, it doesn't mean that it's welcome. And I have to just point that in and put that out there, just because a lot of, it's there in the consciousness or in the words of people or in policies that, we should make Ireland a more diverse community, or even within the arts and all of that. That does not necessarily mean that it's welcomed, and we have to be, I have to point that out, that it's, people might mouth it, but they don't really welcome it in their hearts. So that's just, unfortunately, that's the way it is.
Yeah, so that thank you very much. We are coming to the end of our time, and I would like to thank you all for this wonderful panel. But before we close this wonderful circle of readings and questions and answers, I wonder, Vincent, if you would like to close this roundtable with a taste of your own writing. You need your microphone. Vincent, the microphone.
Now I would. I found myself, oddly enough, through these few months of lockdown, writing a number of stories for children, and one is about a girl and a boy who go in search of a tune. It's called The Hill of Tunes, and it will be a little performance piece, a little theatre piece at a children's festival next June. The other is a story about a boy who wants to run away during lockdown. It's called Larkin and Lockdown. I'll read a tiny piece from it, and in it, the little boy, Larkin, is breaking into his piggy bank to get the money to run away. He took the box out and put it on the floor. He took the top off and looked in. The piggy bank was gold, a fat, jolly-looking gold pig with a smiley snout. It had lots of money inside. Birthday money, Christmas money, treat money, grandma and granddad money, other granny and granddad money, uncle and aunt money. Larkin lifted the piggy bank out and held it in his arms, then placed it carefully in a green rug. He went very quickly and peeped into Mum's studio. She was spraying something, so she was wearing a mask and goggles, and she was listening to music on her headphones. Still better to be careful. Mummy seemed to have several extra sets of eyes and ears, and she could smell the smallest little scent from the other end of the house. He tiptoed past and stole a hammer from the bench beside her. He held his breath and was very quiet. Done. Yes, do you want to come in? He stole back into his room and stood for a moment looking down at the piggy bank. Dad had bought it for him one time when they went to Edinburgh. The boy lives in Scotland. Larkin had seen it in a shop window and loved the pig. He loved it even more when he found out that you could keep money in it. He passed his piggy bank. He patted his piggy bank. It won't really hurt, he said. And anyway, I'd glue you back together again. He knew Dad would be upset, but Larkin would take him by the hand and explain everything. Dad would understand. He took a deep breath, then whack, bang, he smashed his piggy bank open and out tumbled the money. It's just a little precursor to the boy who wants to run away. But the times.
Thank you, Vincent. That's wonderful. We need to close, but I would like to take Consul General Oein Bennett's last question. A fascinating exchange so far. A question for all. What advice would you give to anyone listening in with an interest in starting their own first short story?
Well, for me, it's just the same advice my friend said to me, just write it down.
I would very warmly and strongly agree, and not just write, record, whatever medium you need to use. Some people like to start the story with a scribble, with a picture, with a different narrative. Just get it out of yourself and into something else, into another space, so it gives it more life. And the main thing you need to do is that don't be waiting for it. There's never a more perfect time than now, you know. And I think that's the main thing, is just start. Don't worry about the end of the process of what it's going to seem like. Just start it.
Mm-hmm.
I'd say look for truth, and even if that truth comes in the form of a lie, go with it.
Wonderful. So thank you very much for your time. Thanks the speakers, the viewers, our students, and hope to see you soon in person. Bye.
Thank you all. Thank you, Beatrice.
Thank you all. Thank you very much. Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.
Bye.